even as the White House contends that there is activity resuming in the Strait, the data we're looking at here at Bloomberg would suggest otherwise. It is just a handful of vessels, and all of them pretty much have ties to Iran. And Iran, of course, is maintaining that you need to have clearance and coordination with the armed services to transit this waterway. So has anything materially changed since this ceasefire began?
We haven't seen anything materially change. What we are hearing is the same as what you're hearing. But there was a note that came out today that Iran would allow 15 vessels to pass through the Strait. That's in comparison to over 40 vessels prior to the war. So even when the Strait opens during this ceasefire, this 2-week ceasefire period, 15 vessels is not very many, and it certainly doesn't clear the backlog of the vessels that are sitting currently in the Middle East Gulf.
Well, so then are energy markets right now mispricing what the reality actually is? We're below $100 a barrel on oil once again, at least in the futures market. Obviously, we've seen something very different in the physical market, Michelle. But I wonder if you kind of share the optimism we've seen reflected over the last few days.
I actually don't share the optimism. In the front of the market, sure, there's going to be, it's certainly possible that part of what we've already seen has been priced into the front of the market. I think that when you look even like 2 months back, because this curve is in such steep backwardation, that the back of the market is certainly undervalued relative to the risks that still exist inside of the marketplace. In addition to, like, even if we can assume that the Strait goes back to some sort of working capacity, and maybe it's 50 or 60%, that's still a significantly slower rate in a time when every single country in the world is going to be focused on energy security and restocking their reserves. So I think that the back of the market is certainly mispriced. And when I say the back, I mean like deck 26 through deck 27. I mean, those months are certainly underpriced unless you're expecting some sort of recessionary action that's going to happen in the global market.
Well, and it's one thing to consider just the idea of flows resuming through the Strait. It's another to consider the actual production capacity of these Gulf states in the first place, as we've obviously seen some infrastructure damage in places like Qatar and LNG facilities, but we also have seen production shut-ins. That's just not a light switch that can turn on and off, right, Michelle? How long is it actually going to take for production that we were seeing to get back up and running?
I think we'll see some countries be able to come back fairly quickly. Like the Saudis will be able to come back fairly quickly. I think that the UAE, there may be some infrastructure damage that needs to be repaired, but if they just shut down their wells, I think they can come back quickly. Iraq is going to take a long time. So it could take a while for us to see Iraqi production come back online. And Kaylee, one thing I want to mention is that everybody's looking at the ships leaving the Strait, but I think one thing we really need to focus on are ships going back into the Strait. So once you evacuate from the Strait and you're floating around the global world, do you want to go back into a war zone that has significant risks of the ceasefires falling apart, or ships running that risk of getting bombed again? So I think really the risks that we're going to see going forward are ships re-entering the Strait, because I think once you evacuate, you probably don't want to go back in.
Well, so then obviously what we're talking about here potentially could be, at least in the medium term, a structural change in the way in which energy is able to flow freely throughout the world. Obviously, we've seen efforts toward workarounds, be it the East-West pipeline, for example, for Saudi Arabia, efforts to kind of focus more on output through the Red Sea. Is this going to be potentially permanent, Michelle, even if we do see eventually a reopening of the Strait and an ultimate long-term deal reached between the U.S. and Iran?
Yes, because it's Israel and Iran. So I think that the risks are going to continue to remain. We're going to continue to see high risk. Insurances are still going to remain high. I would guess that it will take at least a year of consistent normal activity for people to feel comfortable transiting the Strait. I think what we're going to see in response to that are all of the countries that have been impacted are going to build infrastructure away from the Strait. So I think that's one thing that's going to happen, is just the inflow of capital to build infrastructure to transit away from the strait so that they don't have access to that, kind of like what the Saudis, they've been preparing for a number of years with the East-West pipeline. It is certainly paying off for them now. I think the Iranian toll is also something that's going to change not just the strait in Iran, the Hormuz Strait, but it could potentially change other straits as well. If they start charging a toll, what makes China not charge a toll or Turkey not charge a toll? So are we going to start to see global trade change just because this will set a precedent for the rest of how other choke points are valued?
Well, as we consider, you raised the Chinese. Obviously, Russia, of course, has been a large focus of conversation, as well as it has been a net beneficiary of what's happening in the Middle East, given its own energy products and the removal of sanctions that we have seen. What happens if we see material removal of sanctions on Iran in a negotiated agreement? How does that change things for the global market?
Well, Iran exports before this happened were at all-time highs. So Iran barrels were still making it to the market. They just weren't making it into the market that was for unsanctioned barrels. So Iran exported out and it went all to China. Now their barrel will move from a sanctioned barrel to an unsanctioned barrel, similar to Venezuela. Venezuela was a sanctioned barrel. Now it's essentially a non-sanctioned barrel, which means that it moves from one pool, which had one buyer, to a pool with many buyers. So it will potentially raise supply marginally across the world, assuming that China doesn't try to replace that Iranian barrel. If China continues to replace the Iranian barrel, then we will see demand for the sanctioned barrel as well as the unsanctioned barrel.